Dean is going to deliver our sermon this morning. I'll leave it to him to tell you all about it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to be here this morning and share with you. Just to give you a bit of background for myself, I'm Gene Howe, Hope's brother, Hope and Paul Fetterall. So if you enjoy the sermon, then that's great to me. If you don't, it's Hope's fault. And if you don't enjoy it, I'm sure Paul will be saying, it's not related to me. So thank you. A bit of background for me. So Churches of Christ I'm very familiar with. I did an interim ministry at Kalamunda Church of Christ some years ago, and then I was about 5 or 6 years in Kalgoorlie as the pastor there. So quite familiar with the Church of Christ setting and everything. So it was great to come and feel at home. So thank you for that. What am I doing at the moment? So I returned from Kalgoorlie and ended up working for Perth City Mission with homeless youth and spent some years there, and then went into, of all things, the training industry. So I'm now a qualified trainer and I specialise in leadership. And that gives me some really interesting interactions. So the last 2 weeks I have actually been training a group of 55 young men from the United Arab Emirates Military School in world leadership. So that was, I learnt a whole lot of new things as well from them. So talk about cultural exchange. That was really, really interesting from that point of view. I gather this is what the money goes into? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, okay, so obviously just a short sermon this morning. So that I sort of saw it from a distance, and I did have a bit of a laugh to myself because some years ago I was in India, which is where my family background is, but I happened to be in India to do some work, do some training, and they actually have a jar like that out the front. So I'm glad the kids have gone, because that's there for the person out the front speaking to spit into. So I'm just going to have to resist that during the sermon. Otherwise, I pity the person who has to count that money afterwards. So, but look, I want to share with you some stuff this morning from, obviously from God's Word, which I get really excited about. I tend to be more of a teacher than I am. I'm not a good pastor. If you were looking for a pastor, which I know you are, don't look for me because I'm not a pastor. I'm more a Bible teacher from that point of view. So well, let's just pray before we come to God's Word. Father, we thank you for your love. We thank you that you do care for us and that you reach us in all the states that we are in at times of our life, when we're feeling down, even when we're good. So I pray this morning that you would just take your word and sink it to our hearts and our minds, and that we may hear your still, soft voice just speak to us as we look at your word. Lord, let your blessing be with us this morning, we pray in your name. Amen. So, John chapter 15. I tend to walk a bit as I preach. Is that all right? I'm glad I said yes, because I'm going to anyway. So, but it's nice to have your permission. And this probably comes, well, I did that even when I was preaching in Kalgoorlie, but it also comes from my training background when I'm training in front of groups of people as well. Okay. Sometimes in ministry, by the way, it can be quite interesting as to how people interpret things. In Kalgoorlie, I actually got them to build a stage very much like this, actually. And they'd never had that before. And I remember one or two people got really upset and just said, Gene's elevating himself above everyone. And I said, actually, it's more so that you can see me, right? Because when I stand down there, some of you are going to go, where's he gone? Right? When you try to look past people. So that's the problem of not being the right height from that point of view. So nice to see that. So John chapter 15, I have really come to love this passage so much. It's probably one of my favourite passages. I keep on coming back to it and discovering new things. And I'm hoping this morning that together we'll discover some new things in this passage. I grew up with this. I grew up in Sunday school. And so I grew up with this. And the problem with growing up with someone is after a while it becomes like a dirt road that is travelled over again and again and again and again. It becomes sort of hard and set. And so the problem with hearing and reading and Sunday school is that you're hearing the same stories again and again and again, and you don't realise there could be another side to it as well. There could be a little bit of a different interpretation. And look, let me share something with you that you probably laugh at in one sense, but do you know what? It was only a few years ago, probably 8 years or so ago, that I realised something about the Bible and the New Testament, that it was written by Jews. And some of you are going to say, we know that. I knew that, but I didn't know that. Right? There's a difference between knowing and really knowing and understanding. And what it did is it led me to a search of saying, so if this was written by Jews, maybe I need to look at how they interpreted some of these things, how they wrote. There's actually, in the New Testament, there was a form of Jewish poetry, for example, and Jesus uses it in some of the sayings, some of the things he does. And if you read some of the Psalms, there's actually a fantastic way of looking at it that I'd never seen before because I didn't understand how the Jews wrote. But what they did, so if you took the book of Romans, for example, what they did was they would match the front part of what they wrote with the end part of what they wrote, and they'd work towards the middle. Okay? Which we're not used to, but that's how they do it. So I suddenly discovered when I started looking at that, Paul, of course, was a Jew, and with Romans he wrote. And the fantastic thing about it is we're sometimes blocked by chapters and verses, aren't we? Because, of course, they didn't have chapters and verses when they wrote it. But if you took the book of Romans, for example, and start from the beginning and the end and work back towards, the fantastic thing is you end up at Romans 8, for all things work together for good. What a great verse. That's your central part. And the whole part of Romans is actually written around that verse. So these are the kind of things I've been really discovering as I go through the Bible and looking at it from Jewish perspective and reading some of the rabbis' interpretations of what they wrote. And I found it fantastic. So this chapter, for example, has taken on a fantastic new meaning for me as I have researched and looked at it. And I want to share that with you this morning because to me, I have to be careful that I don't take, you've probably heard the word that if you take a text out of context, it becomes a pretext, right? And it's really quite true. The context of why something was written or how it was written actually does become quite important. And this chapter is no exception. Okay, so it's Luke chapter 15, and John. Sorry, no, Luke. It is Luke. Sorry. Did I say John? Okay, ignore me. All right. Ignore me on the things I'm wrong on, and just remember the things that I'm right on. Okay, it should be Luke. Okay, Luke chapter 15. Where we're going to be looking at the parable of the prodigal son or the lost son. And it really should probably be titled, instead of the prodigal son, it probably should be titled the forgiving father. Right? Because that's actually what the emphasis is on rather than the son. Now it starts out with verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. Now, I'm not going to read all these parables, but you have verse 3 through to about verse 7 is about the 100 sheep. And one loses, he loses one of the sheep. And then you've got verses 8 to 10 where this woman loses a coin. And then you've got verses 11 through to the end of the chapter, really, 32, where it's about the son. Now, the word lost appears in all of those parables. And there's a reason for that. All right. So Jesus uses that word lost several times. And he's really, the context of this is the Pharisees saying, this man eats with sinners and he eats with the tax collectors. And of course the tax collectors were Jewish and they had the right to go and collect the taxes from the people, and the way they made their money was they overcharged people, sent back to Rome what was required, but they kept money for themselves, and that's why they were hated. Right, firstly, they're Jewish, and secondly, they're working for the enemy. Right, that's how they were seen in the Jewish community. And yet here's Jesus associated with them and meeting with them and spending time with them. And the tax collectors and sinners, and again, I don't know about in your mind, but the word sinners, you think of a moral sin or things like that, and that's not necessarily how they saw. So again, when I was doing a bit of research on it, the Pharisees saw anyone as a sinner who didn't live life the same way they did, who didn't agree with them. Anyone who didn't agree with them or didn't live the way they lived, they were considered sinners. All right? So not necessarily our idea of what a sinner would be, all right, from that point of view. But there they are, they're muttering about that. So they're standing there watching him as Jesus is there. These sinners and the tax collectors, look at him mixing with these people. And Jesus then tells these 3 stories. The first one is about the 100 sheep, and he loses one. And again, it's really interesting because I'm not going to give you all the Greek words, okay? You are safe this morning. I will tell you one Greek word a bit later on. But when you look behind the passage, that word lost, or he loses one, it's actually comes from the word careless. Right? Careless. In other words, this shepherd was careless. He got 99 sheep to the fold and discovered he'd lost one. How do they do that? How do I lose one sheep? And it's because of his carelessness. And the same with the woman and the coin, right? She discovered she'd lost one coin, and that coin was worth a day's wage in those days. Again, it was about her carelessness, right, that she had lost this. Now, that becomes a little bit important a little bit later on, because in one sense, the father lost his son. He was careless with him. Right? And we'll discover some things as we look at it. So let's have a look at the verse 11. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. As soon as Jesus said that, thoughts would immediately have come back to these people. They were Jewish, they knew their history. So immediately, there was a father who had 2 sons. Oh, is he talking about Abraham? He had 2 sons. He had Ishmael and he had Isaac. Or is he talking about, and then he talks about, the 2 sons. Could it be Cain and Abel that he's going to tell a story about? That idea of the 2 sons, don't forget these were Jewish people Jesus was talking to. So as soon as he said there was a father who had 2 sons, in their minds, they're thinking of their history. They're thinking of what they can, the 2 sons, wow. And so he now goes to talk on Joseph and Esau, another 2 sons. Is he talking about them? So Jesus is setting us a bit of a familiar situation for them, because in all of those situations, Esau and Jacob and Ishmael and Isaac, Cain and Abel, the oldest son was the problem. The oldest son was the one, the younger son was the one that was spoiled, right, from their point of view. So immediately Jesus is setting this scene about the prodigal son. And it says, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He is lost and found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered him, Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes come home, you kill the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. There is so much in that story. There's almost worth 3 or 4 sermons, I think, from that point of view, because there's just so much in it. So let's have a look at this. Now, the fact that the younger son came to him and said, I want my share of the property, in actual fact, we tend to go, that's a terrible thing, but in actual fact, that did happen in those days, and you could do that. You could request to get your inheritance ahead of time before your father died, right? You could actually get your inheritance. Now, it meant he had to divide the property, okay? So there are several things. He had to divide the property, which means now the property is going to be reduced. No wonder the older son was angry when his father says to him, your young brother's come back and he's back in the fold of the family. Realise this, the younger son had taken what he got for the property, he'd taken that money, all right, so they no longer had that part of the property, but under their rights, under their inheritance laws, now the son comes back into the family, he will again get an inheritance when his father dies. So he's actually taking some of the property that would normally go to the older brother. No wonder the older brother was angry. Hey, how can you do that? Some of this is mine, and now you're going to divide that up. You've already divided the property up. Now you're going to do it again. There's going to be a reduced inheritance. Can you see why the older brother was angry? Boy, I would be, if it were me. Wow, what do you mean I'm not going to get as much as I thought I would? All right, how can I buy that car that I was going to buy now? I'm going to have to go and work for it. All right. So there's something that we need to just keep in mind when it comes to the older brother. But I want you to begin to see a little bit of things, because I had always been taught from a young kid that the young brother, he goes away, and by the way, when it says he squandered, he went to and he squandered his wealth in wild living. And the word behind that, the whole Greek meaning behind that, is that he was careless with his spending. He just blew his money on everything that he wanted to. There was no thought of what will I do for the future. There was no thought. He just extravagantly is behind that word. He extravagantly spent that money, right, to enjoy himself and enjoy life. And then suddenly, of course, discovered, all the money is gone. There was a famine that came along. And he's going, what am I going to do? All my friends have deserted me. Where do I go from here? And so what he did is he hired himself out. In those days, what used to happen, that if you needed work, you would go, and you didn't have any work, you would go to a certain place, to the marketplace, and you would wait there. And in the morning, people who needed help or needed to hire someone, they would come to the marketplace and they would see who was there, and they would choose someone or a couple of people, if they needed a couple, to come and work for them, and they would pay them for that day. You remember there's another story Jesus told about people who were hired in the morning and in the afternoon and late in the evening. When it came to being paid, they all got paid the same. And so that was quite a common thing in those days. So this is what that young son did when it said he hired himself out. He would have gone to the marketplace. He would have waited there in the morning until someone came to hire him. And he found someone came and hired him to work with the pigs, which of course for the Jews was a big no-no. You know, the pigs were considered the uncleanest of animals at all. That's why they were forbidden to have anything to do with pigs. And this guy finds himself working with the pigs, and he is desperate, and he would have been brought up that way. But is he at that point? We don't know, but is he at the point where he says, well, yeah, I know we've been taught that, but it doesn't mean I'm going to do it. I'm going to work with the pigs because that's all I can get, and, you know, let's throw tradition out by the window. And it says that he was hired, which meant he would have almost been like a contract. He goes and he works for the pigs and he gets paid. That's what it's sort of about in one sense. But he was also hungry, so he probably wasn't getting paid much. You know, he wanted to eat these pods that the pigs were eating. No one even gave him any to eat. They were all given to the pigs. So he comes to this point of desperation and says, what am I doing here? You know, the people back in my father's household, they're paid better than this. They're looked after. They have what they need. Why don't I go back? And he actually rehearses it. And he says, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. In verse 18, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. So he got up and went to his father. Now, this is interesting for me because I had always thought that the younger son was repentant. He's sorry for what he's done. I'm going to go back and say sorry to my father. But that's actually not the case, right? Because when you start to look at it and again find out what is behind this, what's the meaning of it, it's really interesting because what he says is, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in your eyes I have sinned, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. That's where it says sinned against heaven and against you. The word's actually before you, and the Greek meaning in that is, in your eyes I have done the wrong thing. He's actually not saying I have done the wrong thing. He's saying in your eyes, which by the way, it's almost typical teenager, isn't it? You know, you think I've done the wrong thing. I'm not saying I've done the wrong thing. That's what you think. Right? I think I've got 2 boys. I remember hearing that. Okay, so it's hard to admit when you're wrong. And in this case, the son is not admitting he's wrong. What he's saying is, I know you think I've done the wrong thing. Right? So he's going to go there and he's practicing it as he goes along. Okay? So again, as I said to you, this is a little bit different to what I've been taught. I thought he was repentant. And that's actually important because, remember, the Pharisees had said this man meets with tax collectors and with sinners. Right? Not necessarily with those who are repentant. So Jesus is telling this story to say, hey, do you know what? And he says this earlier in one of the other Gospels, that I haven't come, a physician hasn't come to heal those who are well, but to heal those who are sick. Right? And sometimes we don't know that we're sick. Sometimes we don't know that what we're doing, because we're so stubborn in our ways, then this is where God's grace comes in. And this chapter is so much about God's grace. Right? Anyway, we've got the son, so he comes and his father sees him, and you've got this really interesting situation. It says the father saw him from a distance. I love that because it means the father was looking out for him. The father is looking for when his son might come home. And I love that. Yet there's another side to it as well that we don't understand unless we understand Jewish tradition. Now, one of the traditions was, and because you've got this thing about he runs to his son. Why did he run to his son? Firstly, it was don't forget the kind of costume they wore in those days. They didn't have jeans, right? But they had the robes, and to run, he would have had to pick those robes up a little bit, which means people would have seen his legs. Right? And I know that sounds strange, but in their tradition and their customs, older men did not bare their legs. Right? It was considered indecent. And here's the father prepared to pull his robes up so he can run to meet his son. But there's another reason as well that we don't understand, because we don't understand how the Jews worked. And that is this. If a Jewish person, don't forget, these villages were small, so they knew everyone. If a Jewish son took his family treasures or took money or inheritance and then went and spent it and wasted it on stuff that was not part of their tradition, if that happened, the Jewish community, if the son came back, the Jewish community would go out to meet them, and they would have a big earthen jar with them, because it was considered absolutely abhorrent for a Jew to lose their money to Gentiles. It was absolutely against their whole tradition. So the community would come out with this jar, and it was the form was called, what they did was called kazazar. It's the only Greek word I'm going to tell you, kazazar. And what it meant was this: they would meet the person coming back, and they would smash that earthen vessel on the ground in front of that person and say to them, "You are no longer a member of our community." And if you look at what some of the rabbis say, they say that's why the father ran, because he wanted to get to his son and welcome him back before the community got to him. He wanted to show his son and the community, I am taking my son back into my family. Because once that had happened and that earthen thing had been smashed, he would have been bound by the Jewish tradition to reject his son. So he runs to meet his son before the rest of the community can make judgment on him. Does that make sense? Adds to me such a depth as to what this passage is about. And then there's the famous part where he says, his older brother, knew exactly what was happening with his younger brother. Because he says to his father when he's angry, this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home. He knew exactly what his brother was doing, but the father didn't. Right? And it's interesting that the father says, this son, he's your brother, he was dead but now is alive. One of the churches that my wife and I spend time with is an Asian church that meets over in Bentley. And we've probably been associated with them for about 12 years, and it is specifically an Asian church. And there are people from all around the world that come to it. It's a university church. And I love it. It's really great, but I also learn a lot. And I was there one Sunday, and they were talking and asking for a different testimony, and this young girl got up and shared. She's from India, right? And this is what she shared. Now, I'd heard that this happened. I'd read about it. I'd never actually heard someone say, this is what happened to me. So she came from a village, and she became a Christian. She went and heard this person speak, and it affected her so deeply, and her friends at university as well. It affected her so deeply, so she became a Christian. And she went home and she told her parents, they were Hindu, and she told her parents that she had become a Christian. And her parents were horrified. How can you reject our faith? How can you do this? What are our neighbours and friends going to think? So please do not tell anyone that you have become a Christian. And she sort of said to them, well, I can't. I'm a Christian. If anyone asks me, and asks me why am I not going to the Hindu temple, then I've got to tell them why. And they said, please don't tell anyone. And of all things we ask, please do not. We know the Christian tradition. Please do not get baptised. Because baptism then is a complete end of what you were, and you now start a new life. But after a while, her conscience got to her, and she really felt that as she was with her faith in God, she needed to get baptised. And her family and her parents pleaded with her, please don't. But she did. She got baptised, and so her parents said to her, "We are going to cut you off from the family. Come and have a last meal with us. Come and have a last meal with us. But after that, you are no longer a part of our family. We disown you. It will be as though you were never born to us." Right? So she went and had this last meal with her. As she was walking away back to where she was staying with her friends who went to university, she started to feel sort of a bit ill. And all of a sudden, as she was walking along, quite a few kilometres, her stomach just started to tighten and she ended up falling by the side of the road. And that's when she realised that in this last meal, her parents had poisoned her, so that she was going to literally be dead to them. Right? That's how much they feared the neighbours and their friends knowing that someone in their family had become a Christian. Fortunately for her, her friends got worried that she wasn't back at the time she said would, and they went looking for her and they found her curled up at the side of the road, unconscious. And they quickly got a cart and they were able to get her to hospital, and they drained her stomach, and she obviously survived because she told the story. That was the first time I had ever come across in my life a real situation where someone who had become a Christian had been so rejected by their family that their family would poison them. That they would no longer be alive to that, so that if they said to them, "Didn't you have a daughter?" they would say, "No, we haven't got a daughter." That's what it means to be dead to us. And when the Father is saying that, your brother was dead and is alive again. That's the kind of background that the Father is using here. It's not that he poisoned him, but as soon as the Son did what he did, in one sense, he was cut off from his community, he was cut off from his family. And for the Father to say, "We need to celebrate and regret because your brother was dead and now he is alive. He was lost and is found." And there's that word "lost" again. And when you think about it, there is a carelessness involved. The Father's lost his Son. The Son's lost to him. We don't even know if he's dead or alive, but I'm still looking out for him. Again, here's the grace that this Father was prepared to go against the traditions of the Jewish community to have his Son return. He was prepared to break tradition, that he would run to get to his Son before the community did, so that he could stop that ceremony happening of the breaking of the jar, where he would no longer be welcome in the community or allowed to come back. That's grace. And that's what God's like to us. The really interesting thing for me is this, that the Father welcomed him back. And we know as well the Son wasn't repentant, because he says, let me be like one of your hired workers. Why not one of your servants? Well, the servants, the family was obviously rich. The servants, they lived on the property. They worked on the property. They didn't get paid. This is part of what they did, right? But the hired workers did get paid. They had a contract for a certain amount of time. So that's why the Son's saying to the Father, "Make me like one of your hired labourers, because there's conditions with that. I only work for a certain time and you have to pay me." Just think about that if one of your kids came home and said that. Well, I know I'm living here, but I want now, you've got to pay me to live here. Right? Wouldn't happen, guys, would it? Absolutely not. And yet here he is. That's why we also know that he wasn't repentant, because he's saying, "Hey, I want to make a deal with you and you pay me. Right? But I want to still have my inheritance and I still want to be your son." Whoa. Okay. The Father totally ignored that. Look, how many times do you and I make deals with God? How many times maybe we mess up? Maybe we do something we shouldn't do and we say, oh God, I'm so sorry, look, I won't do it again, or, we go like that. I remember someone saying, you know what, God, I want you to help me win the lottery, right? It was a $10 million lottery, and God, I tell you now, help me to win the lottery and I will give you 10%. Wow, how generous. Keep 9 million for yourself and 1 million to God. But do you know when we make these deals with God, or we mess up and sin and we go, God, I'm so sorry, I won't do that again, I won't, and guess what happens? We do it again, And yet God is still gracious to us and still welcomes us and still wraps his arms around us and says, I love you. Think about this. This son came back, not necessarily repentant of what he'd done because he didn't see what he'd done. He didn't necessarily understand it. That's the good thing. God understands that sometimes we don't understand. He still loves us anyway. God can see through our excuses, and he can see through the things that we do, the things that we try and get away with, and the little deals that we make. And what is so beautiful about it is that God still loves us and welcomes us back. Sometimes it takes time for us to realise. It could be years. I know I look back on my life and see there are times and I go, oh God, I am so sorry that I ever said that or did that. But I realise even though I've only now realised it, God forgave me back then. He still loved me. He didn't limit his love to me. He still loved me. That is so much what God is like, isn't it? He welcomes us back and he loves us in spite of, because we're his children. And that's what you do in family. Right? This gives me such a picture of God that I've not seen before, that I've begun to understand. I think as I have grown older in my life, I find myself reading more and just coming to love God more and realising how much he loves us. Right? That his love is limitless. There's no limit on his life. And I love that picture in one sense, that the father running to his son, because God doesn't just sit there and wait. He works in our lives. He does stuff that we don't even realise, that maybe years later we look back and go, now I can see God. If only we knew what God looked like, this gives us a little bit of a picture. Right. There's a story I heard which is really good, of this little girl, and she was at school, she was in an art class. She was only about 7 or 8, and it was in a religious session, and the teachers were talking about God. Now this little girl, she'd never really been interested in school, never really got involved in stuff, and the teacher said, I want you to draw a picture now. And she saw this little girl, Sarah, and she saw, I hope there's no Sarahs in the church. Anyways, there's a little girl, Sarah, and she was scribbling away, earnestly. And the teacher was really surprised because Sarah had not really ever got involved in anything. She used to sort of sit back and does that ring a bell? Yeah, okay. She used to sit back and just not, And the teacher went up to her really curious to think, why is she suddenly drawing? And she said, she looked down at what she was drawing and all this scribble and stuff like that. And she said, Sarah, what are you drawing? And Sarah looked up at the teacher and said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher thought, uh-oh. So she said, Sarah, you realise that no one knows what God looks like. And without missing a bit, Sarah said, they will in a minute. This paints a picture of God, this chapter. Paints a picture of God in all his glory and in all his love. That he loves us so much that even though at that time we're making all these excuses and stuff, he still wraps his arms around us and loves us. I love that. I love that. That's how God wins people. That's how we win people, by showing the love of God to the people around us, which is what we're called to do. There's a really great story, and it is a Jewish story, a really great story, of a king who lives in a faraway country, whose son rebelled against him, left home, did similar to the prodigal son, and wasted his time, wasted his money. And he fell into poor times, and his father, the king, heard about it. And he sent a messenger to his son saying, come home, come home. I understand, come home. And his son was embarrassed. He knew he had done the wrong thing. He knew he had messed up. And he sent him back to his father the message through the messenger saying, I can't. I just can't. And the father sent the messenger back saying, then come as far as you can, and I'll come the rest of the way. That's God. Sometimes it can be so hard to admit to who we are, to what we've done, or what we haven't done, that we almost go, I can't, God, I can't. And God says, Jean, come as far as you can. I'll come the rest of the way. Let's meet. That's so much the love of God. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your love. Help us to realise afresh just how much you love us, just how much you care for us. And that even if it seems to break tradition or what we think is real or true or whatever, you love us in spite of. And I thank you for that, Lord. I thank you that even when we think we're right and then discover we are wrong or we're off track, you still love us. You don't withdraw your love, but you just continue to love us until we come home. Lord, I pray this morning that if there are people here this morning who maybe feel, I just can't, that they hear your voice saying, come as far as you can. I will come the rest of the way. I pray, Lord, that this morning we will feel your arms wrap us in your love, because that's what you desire to do. We thank you in your name. Amen.